They believed that once the fences disappeared, everything broken inside them would repair itself naturally. But what happens when freedom arrives and nothing feels lighter? When choice returns and paralyzes instead of heals? And when the world expects men to move forward even though something essential inside them never learned how to leave the camp behind? For a long time, freedom had existed only as an idea, distant enough to remain untouched by emotion, because imagining it too closely would have made survival harder inside the camp. The men allowed themselves to believe that release would solve what captivity had damaged, not because they examined that belief carefully, but because believing in it required less effort than questioning it. Freedom became a simple promise, a single moment that would separate suffering from recovery. When that moment finally came, it did not arrive with the relief they had imagined, because relief assumes an immediate contrast, and the contrast was missing. The fences were gone, the routines dissolved, and the authority that had shaped daily life no longer dictated movement. Yet nothing inside them responded with the expected sense of release. Instead of lightness, there was hesitation, as if the mind had not received instructions on how to proceed without structure. The men discovered that captivity had taught them how to endure limitation, but freedom demanded a different skill set entirely, one they had not practiced. Inside the camp, decisions had been minimized, and minimizing decisions had preserved emotional energy. Outside, decisions returned all at once, asking to be made without guidance, and this sudden demand created tension rather than comfort. Simple choices felt disproportionate in weight, because choice itself had been absent for so long that it no longer felt natural. The men hesitated over ordinary matters, not because they lacked intelligence or desire, but because the instinct to decide had been dulled through months or years of waiting. Freedom expected initiative, while their survival had depended on restraint. The absence of routine removed the quiet protection that predictability had once offered. Inside the camp, each day had followed a familiar path, limiting uncertainty and reducing emotional risk. Outside, days appeared open and undefined, requiring planning, direction, and confidence in outcomes that could no longer be taken for granted. The men realized that freedom did not automatically return what captivity had suspended, because habits formed under pressure do not dissolve simply because conditions change. The reflex to wait, to observe, and to avoid unnecessary action remained intact, shaping behavior even when it no longer served a purpose. What unsettled them most was not fear, but confusion, because confusion offered no clear response. They were no longer told where to go, what to do, or when to stop, and this absence of instruction exposed how deeply they had relied on external structure. Freedom, rather than resolving uncertainty, amplified it. The belief that release would repair everything had assumed that damage was temporary and external, tied to fences and guards. What the men began to sense was that much of what had changed existed internally, shaped quietly over time, and carried forward regardless of location. By the end of this phase, the realization had begun to form that freedom was not an ending, but a beginning that demanded more than survival had ever required. The camp had prepared them to endure constraint, but it had not prepared them to rebuild themselves once constraint was removed, and that gap would define the next stage of their struggle. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As days passed outside the camp, the men began to understand that freedom did not remove pressure, but redistributed it, shifting responsibility inward instead of lifting it away. Inside the camp, limits had been imposed clearly, narrowing life into manageable routines. But outside, the absence of limits required constant judgment, and judgment demanded confidence that had quietly eroded during captivity. They noticed that even minor decisions produced disproportionate fatigue because deciding meant accepting the possibility of error, and error now felt more consequential than it ever had inside the camp. When structure disappeared, the mind searched instinctively for replacement patterns, but none arrived, leaving hesitation where certainty had once existed. Freedom offered options without guidance, and that openness created unease rather than relief. The men found themselves delaying action, not because they lacked opportunity, but because opportunity itself felt unfamiliar. Waiting had been rewarded during captivity, while initiative had been unnecessary, and this conditioning did not reverse simply because circumstances changed. The instinct to pause before acting remained intact, shaping behavior even when urgency returned. Interactions with others revealed this shift clearly, because conversation outside the camp assumed autonomy and intention. Questions that expected preference, opinion, or direction felt intrusive, forcing the men to confront how little practice they had in expressing choice. Responses came slowly, filtered through habits formed under confinement, where speaking less had reduced risk and preserved energy. The men became aware that freedom expected them to define themselves again, to choose roles, paths, and futures without instruction. This expectation felt overwhelming because captivity had taught them to exist without reference to long-term goals. Survival had required focus on the immediate present, and now the present expanded outward, demanding planning that felt abstract and exhausting. Simple routines that once anchored daily life were gone, and without them, time felt unstructured and unstable. Days no longer followed predictable patterns, and unpredictability reintroduced uncertainty that endurance alone could not resolve. The men had learned how to tolerate waiting, but freedom required momentum, and momentum had not been practiced. Some attempted to recreate structure artificially, clinging to repetitive habits that offered a sense of order, even when those habits no longer made sense. Others withdrew internally, conserving energy as they had learned to do, hoping that clarity would return on its own. Neither response brought relief because freedom did not respond to passivity in the way captivity had. The belief that release would restore normalcy had overlooked the extent to which normalcy itself had changed. The men were no longer the same individuals who had entered the camp, and the world they returned to was not the one they remembered. Freedom assumed continuity, but captivity had interrupted it deeply. By the end of this stage, it became clear that choice, once imagined as liberation, had become a source of strain because it demanded skills that captivity had quietly suppressed. Freedom did not fail them because it was cruel, but because it arrived without acknowledging what survival had cost, leaving the men to navigate a world that expected initiative from those who had learned how to live without it. As freedom continued without delivering the clarity they had expected, the men began to sense a growing distance between themselves and the world around them. Not because they were physically separated, but because their internal rhythms no longer matched those of ordinary life. Outside the camp, people moved with purpose, spoke with confidence, and made decisions quickly, while the men carried a slower pace shaped by years of waiting and restraint. This difference did not announce itself dramatically, yet it influenced every interaction, because conversations assumed shared expectations that no longer existed. Questions about plans, ambitions, and intentions felt difficult to answer, not due to lack of thought, but because thinking in those terms had been unnecessary for so long. The men responded cautiously, often simplifying their words, avoiding detail, and withdrawing from discussions that required direction. They noticed that others expected visible relief, gratitude, or enthusiasm, and when these emotions did not appear, misunderstandings followed. Freedom was assumed to be restorative, and any lingering hesitation was interpreted as stubbornness, indifference, or emotional distance. The men struggled to explain what they themselves did not yet understand, because the gap between survival and recovery had never been acknowledged openly. As this gap widened, the men became increasingly aware of how captivity had shaped their social instincts. Inside the camp, relationships had been defined by proximity and shared routine rather than personal choice. Outside, relationships required initiative, expression, and emotional availability, all of which felt unfamiliar and draining. The men conserved energy by limiting interaction, a strategy that had once ensured survival but now contributed to isolation. Silence, which had once provided safety, followed them into freedom, because speaking carried risk when words might expose confusion or vulnerability. The men found comfort in observation rather than participation, watching life continue around them without feeling fully present within it. This detachment did not stem from rejection of others, but from uncertainty about how to re-enter a world that expected immediate engagement. The realization emerged slowly that freedom demanded reintegration, not merely release, and reintegration required skills that had not been practiced under confinement. The men were no longer confined by fences, yet they felt constrained by habits that limited expression and connection. What had once been adaptive now created barriers that were invisible but persistent. Attempts to bridge this distance often felt forced because effort replaced instinct. Social cues that once guided behavior naturally now required conscious interpretation, and conscious interpretation was exhausting. The men retreated further, not because they wished to be alone, but because isolation felt easier to manage than the complexity of renewed social life. Over time, this withdrawal reinforced the sense of being out of place, as the men perceived themselves as observers rather than participants. Freedom offered access, but not belonging, and belonging could not be rebuilt quickly after years of emotional suspension. The men existed within society, yet remained slightly removed from it, carrying an internal tempo that no longer aligned with the world's pace. By the end of this phase, it became clear that freedom had not restored connection automatically, because connection required initiative, vulnerability, and trust, all of which had been quieted for survival's sake. The men were learning that leaving the camp did not mean leaving behind the habits it had instilled, and that the distance they felt was not imposed by the world, but carried within them as a lasting imprint of captivity. As distance from the camp increased, the men began to confront a quieter problem that had no clear solution, because identity, unlike routine, could not be restored through repetition alone. Inside the camp, roles had been simplified to the point where identity required little definition, as survival had replaced individuality and conformity had reduced the need to ask who they were beyond endurance. Outside, that simplicity vanished, and with it came questions that demanded answers without offering guidance. They realized that captivity had suspended identity rather than destroyed it, leaving it dormant and untested for long periods of time. Now, freedom required them to reclaim it actively, to decide how to live, what to value, and where to belong, tasks that felt overwhelming after years of having those decisions removed. The absence of instruction created a vacuum, and vacuums invite uncertainty rather than clarity. The men noticed that labels returned quickly, imposed by others who expected them to resume familiar roles. Yet those roles felt distant and incomplete. Being a worker, a citizen, a family member, or a neighbor required emotional engagement and initiative that had not been practiced under confinement. The men hesitated, not because they rejected these identities, but because they no longer recognized themselves within them. Memory complicated this process further because the past no longer felt continuous. The person they had been before the camp seemed disconnected from the person who had survived it, and neither version felt fully applicable to the present. This disjunction made it difficult to draw meaning from experience, because meaning depends on coherence, and coherence had been interrupted by years of suspended life. Attempts to reconstruct identity often felt artificial, as if the men were performing roles rather than inhabiting them. Actions lacked conviction, and decisions felt provisional, made without confidence in long-term direction. The men moved forward cautiously, aware that they were expected to define themselves, yet unsure which definitions were still valid. The world offered freedom, but not reassurance, expecting adjustment without acknowledging transformation. The men sensed that their internal compass no longer pointed reliably toward purpose, because purpose had not been required for survival. Endurance had been enough, and now endurance no longer applied. This realization introduced a new kind of fatigue, one that was not physical but existential. The effort required to answer fundamental questions about self and future felt heavier than the physical hardships of captivity had ever been. The men were not broken in the visible sense, but they were unmoored, navigating a life that demanded internal direction they had not practiced. By the end of this phase, identity no longer appeared as something that could simply be resumed, but as something that needed to be rebuilt deliberately and slowly. The men understood that freedom had returned responsibility without restoring certainty, leaving them to reconstruct meaning in a world that assumed continuity where none existed. Over time, the men began to understand that freedom was not a return to life as it had been before the camp, because life itself had moved on without waiting for them to catch up. The world no longer operated at the slower, contained rhythm they had adapted to, and the skills that once ensured survival offered little guidance in a space where initiative, confidence, and self-direction were quietly expected. They noticed that effort now came from within rather than being imposed, and this shift required a kind of strength they had not practiced. Inside the camp, endurance had been enough, because endurance allowed them to persist without deciding where to go next. Outside, endurance alone produced stagnation, as progress demanded choices that felt unfamiliar and exhausting. The men sensed that freedom required them to rebuild themselves actively, to reconnect actions with meaning, and to tolerate uncertainty without the protective boundaries that confinement had once provided. This process felt heavier than captivity had ever been, not because it was cruel, but because it placed responsibility back into their hands without instruction or reassurance. What made this stage particularly difficult was how invisible the struggle appeared. There were no fences to point to, no guards to blame, and no routines to follow unquestioningly. From the outside, the men seemed free, functional, and capable, yet internally they carried habits that limited movement, confidence, and expression. They realized that the camp had shaped them efficiently, teaching them how to survive within constraint, but it had not prepared them to navigate openness. The calm they had developed to endure captivity now slowed them in a world that valued momentum. The patience that once protected them now delayed them, creating friction between who they were expected to be and who they had become. This realization did not arrive with anger or despair, but with a quiet recognition that survival and recovery were not the same thing. Freedom had not failed them, but it demanded more than survival could provide. It asked for reinvention, for initiative, and for the willingness to face uncertainty without retreating into the habits that had once kept them safe. By the end of this phase, the men understood why freedom had not fixed everything, because fixing required active participation in life rather than endurance alone. The camp had been something they could survive, but freedom required them to live again, and living demanded skills that could not be learned under confinement. And so the truth became clear that the hardest part of their journey had not been captivity itself, but the moment when survival ended and the responsibility to move forward quietly began. Freedom did not arrive as a clean break between suffering and recovery, because nothing inside them had been waiting for a signal to return to normal. The camp had ended, but the habits it created continued quietly, shaping how they moved, decided, and related to the world around them. What remained was not fear or anger, but a subtle uncertainty about how to live without boundaries that once made life manageable. Survival had required patience and restraint, while freedom demanded direction and initiative, and that transition offered no instructions. In the end, they understood that captivity had taught them how to endure, but freedom required them to choose, to act, and to risk uncertainty again. And for many, that realization marked the beginning of a struggle far more difficult than survival itself. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.